Welcome back to another episode of Christ in Capital, the show that wants to encourage you to love God, love neighbor, and build something. My name's Dustin Johnson, and this is going to be a fantastic Quick Thoughts episode. Nathan, what's up?
Hey, Dustin, thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, man. Super excited. What did we get ourselves into this week? What are we talking about?
We are talking about a recent book that has come out called In Defense of Looting.
Mm-hmm.
And there was an NPR interview last week with the author that kind of covers a lot of the author's main ideas. Seems like it's a fairly relevant topic to discuss in the midst of all the riots going on.
Yeah. And when you sent me this article, I was like, this can't be real. Like, I want to preface this by saying that I think maybe this lady is maybe she's like way far on the fringe, like the extreme side, but I don't know. Maybe she's not. Maybe this is where our cultural, social justice movements are going. And I hope not. But yeah, we're gonna talk about it. But before we dive in, I want to read just a few quotes that I pulled from the article, just to give the listeners a little taste of what she's all about. And there was like, as I was reading this article, I'm like, I want to quote everything in here because every part of it is pretty damning. So I guess the first one I pulled out was, she says, looting is a powerful tool to bring about real, lasting change in society. The rioters who smash windows and take items from stores, she claims, are engaging in a powerful tactic that questions the justice of, quote, law and order, end quote, and the distribution of property and wealth in an unequal society. So she talks about distribution. Who's distributing, and what are they distributing? The next quote is, when I use the word looting, I mean the mass expropriation of property, mass shoplifting during a moment of upheaval or riot. That's the thing I'm defending. I'm not defending any situation in which property is stolen by force. What in the world is she talking about? I wonder how forceful you have to be to get through a storefront window or a locked Target door. And then, before, I guess, there's so many, gosh. And this one I think might segue into what you want to talk about, Nathan. A business being attacked in the community is ultimately about attacking modes of oppression that exist in the community. It is true and possible that there are instances historically when businesses have refused to reopen or to come back, but that is part of the inequity of the society, that people live in places where there is only one place where they can get access to something like food or medicine. That question assumes, what if you're in a food desert? But the food desert is already an incredibly unjust situation. There's this real tendency to try and blame people for fighting back, for revealing the inequity of the injustice that's already been formed by the time that they're fighting. So she's like morphing the definition of justice. Like if you live in a food desert, that's unjust. Yeah, just some of my thoughts.
Right.
And I had some other points too, but I think we need to stop there and let you kind of run with it.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that we could attack about the position itself. I mean, even right there, she's defending the idea of looting the one grocery store because they're already in a food desert and that's unjust. So, but why, if you are in a food desert, would you support destroying the one place you would get food?
Yeah.
There's quite a lot in here, and I'm sure you're going to link the article that people can go back and read it, that we could pick apart for inconsistencies or even, the underlying Marxism that's obviously at play here with viewing everything through the lens of power structures and stuff. But one of the reasons why I thought this was so relevant to talk about is because even though she is defending a view that right now is fairly radical, I think it's representative of two things that are very much in vogue in our culture. And the first is that while a lot of people aren't coming out and saying looting is a good thing, a lot of people are doing looting, right? And they are looting, and they are than complaining when they get arrested for it. So we're actually having people doing it, even if there aren't a lot of people who are publicly supporting it. But then the second thing is that her tactics for why looting is okay, the moral frameworks that she appeals to, is the same moral framework that's been appealed to throughout this whole 2020 chaos.
Yeah.
So that's why I think that this is where the conversation is shifting. Because if you're going to be using the same moral arguments and the same moral framework, it's only a matter of time before this becomes mainstream.
Yeah.
So I thought we could unpack a little bit kind of the moral framework and arguments that she's using.
Yes. Yeah, let's do it. And in case we don't get to it, I just want to like point out a few things in case the listeners go back and read this article. One of the things I noted, and you kind of hinted at, was it's the whole Marxist like power struggle, power dynamics. There's this like distinction between oppressed class versus oppressor class, and it oddly kind of juxtaposes with the capital versus labor kind of dichotomy that you see all throughout history with Marx and with the Soviet Union and all these places. You've got the common man who's like the labor, and then you've got the business owner who's capital, so to speak. And we need to tear down that framework just from the ground up, because the common man or the guy who owns a business is not privy to any information or is not given any special access to anything that common man isn't. I mean, we just need to look at it on a spectrum rather than in classes. We tend to divide people up into classes, oppressed versus oppressed, or oppressor versus oppressed, and she does a lot of that in this article. That was one thing I wanted to point out, and people will like understand or kind of like pick up on that if they're reading the article. I don't know if you wanted this.
Yeah, well, you're right. There's this chilling part of the article where she defends looting against small businesses.
Yeah.
And she says, that even progressives have bought into this myth that the small business owner is the good guy. But small businesses are just as oppressive as big businesses, often more so. And so they're just as much a part of the problem. And that reminded me of our conversation about the kulaks back in the day.
I thought the same exact thing. I was like, this is that discussion. But go ahead, keep going.
Right. And then it makes you think, okay, then what are people striving for? If equality means that no one can own a business, no one can work for themselves, no one can have people working for them, then we're basically trying to create equality with the lowest common denominator.
Yeah, it's like equality of poverty.
Right. Let's tear everybody down. And so the American dream used to be that you could own your own business, that you could work for yourself, that you could have people working for you and build something that would last. And she is actually saying the reverse of that anyone who does that's the bad person, and they're part of the oppressive system.
Yep.
And so she there's just one juicy quote that kind of reveals how ridiculous that is.
I bet you we picked the same one. Go.
Yeah, she says that looting attacks the idea of property, and it attacks the idea that in order for someone to have a roof over their head or have a meal ticket, they have to work for a boss in order to buy things that people just like them somewhere else in the world had to make under the same conditions. It points to the way in which that's unjust. And the reason that the world is organized that way, obviously, is for the profit of the people who own the stores and the factories. So you get to the heart of that property relation and demonstrate that without police and without state oppression, we can have things for free.
Yeah, that's the exact quote that I pulled out. Man, how quickly are we going to the argument that private property should be abolished? Like, that's where it's all going. And
right.
Man.
Right, exactly. Because once you start defending looting from the perspective, and this is what she says it's just property. It's just property. She says, I'm not in favor of violence against people, but there's no such thing as violence against property. So you can take property, you can smash windows, you can steal stuff, and that's not hurting anybody.
Right.
Because really, who's to say that that's your property and not somebody else's property? The only reason why you have it and somebody else has it is because somebody's been oppressed somewhere down the line.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And that was the other point that I pulled out in a couple quotes from it, but I'm not going to read the quotes. It was just her like, it, um, it seems like a lot of these movements do this is they change the definition slightly of words, and so violence becomes like, um, it's not like it's not the normal definition. It's just a whole bunch of massaging of definitions. It's like a battle of the dictionary. I think I don't know who says that. It's like, that's the best cultural
Right.
tactic to make change is to have control of the dictionary. And
It's a,
she has this one thing where she was talking about how like she was defending looters and rioters because what common society or pop culture likes to do is separate the distinct or make a distinction between rioters and peaceful protesters. And she's like, no, they're all the same. Looters and rioters are part of the system. That's part of the thing. And so she was like, when peaceful protest organizers, they'll tell police officers their march routes so that the police will stop traffic for them. So you've got and she says, so you've got a dozen heavily armed men standing here watching you march. That doesn't make me feel safe. What about that is nonviolent? Activists themselves are doing no violence, but there is so much potential violence all around them. So like the police standing there with guns is violence, but looting is not violence. On college campuses today, speech is violence, but then in these protests, silence is violence. And so you've got like, yeah, it's just
yeah, you summarized really well the paradoxical state that we find ourselves in.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we get down to some of the moral arguments she uses here, I think it's important for all of us to be aware of these because they're coming up time and time again. So she's trying to justify looting by a backwards tactic and a forwards tactic. So the backwards tactic is if you can identify that something has been gotten through unjust means, oppression, inequality, somewhere back in history. Okay. So it could be back when the settlers came in and killed Native Americans and took their land. It could be back during the time of slavery. If you can identify that somewhere down the line, what somebody has is the result, at least partially, of oppression and injustice, then that frees you up to act in an unjust or oppressive way for the sake of equality or justice.
Yeah, it sounds like vengeance.
Right. So she says here that that looting in the context of a black uprising attacks the history of whiteness and white supremacy. Mm-hmm. The very basis of property in the U.S. is derived through whiteness and through black oppression, through the history of slavery and settler domination of the country. So you could try to pick apart that way of telling history, because I think there's a lot of exceptions to that rule. But the reality is that the assumption is that since pretty much everything we have in the U.S. Can be traced back to evil colonization or evil slavery, then private property is bad. And because it's bad, we can then change the rules of the game as to how we interact with other people's private property. So that's the first tactic, is identify some sort of historical or chronological link to evil and injustice to justify an unjust act.
Yeah. And that's I think a lot of people wouldn't put it that way right now, but that's where it's going. I think ultimately, if I think it's Walter Williams that says, small steps in any direction will ultimately get you to your destination. And that is where it's going. Like you said, if you can found everything in oppression somewhere in the distant past, then everything downstream from that is a result of oppression and can be upended justifiably, so to speak.
Right. Well, and we see that on a more a less extreme stance being applied to reparations or being applied to affirmative action or being applied to all sorts of rhetoric against wealthy people, right?
Yep.
It's the reason why we need to tax the rich to an extreme amount. So the same arguments are being used, but to support things that the government does instead of things that looters do. But of course, the argument can be made that the government could be a kind of looter if all of these government actions are based on them taking your money.
Yeah, exactly. Like
taxes.
The solution that you're proposing is not different than how we got here.
Yeah,
you can't.
In the same rhetoric. Oh, go ahead.
You can't. I've heard it said you can't unscramble the egg. I mean, let's just make a really nice omelet. How about that? It highlights the importance of why forgiveness and reconciliation is in a society. Like you can't. I mean, maybe this is a different discussion, but there's definitely injustice in the past. There definitely is, but the solution to it is not more injustice. But yeah, we could that could take us down a long rabbit trail. So I don't know if you want to go into your next.
Well, yeah. So I guess the last thing I would say on the first part is that when we're having this kind of national conversation, it needs to be challenged. The assumption that the fact that in the previous history of the U.S., certain things have been acquired through injustice, that fact alone has any moral bearing on what we should do today. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but why aren't we having that conversation? I think a lot of people just kind of assume, well, if you can identify some sort of injustice from the past, then you've already made your argument. And you haven't made your argument. Nobody has agreed yet as to how much moral bearing that fact has on present actions. It's a very complex ethical question.
Yeah.
And I think we need to have more of that conversation before we can, agree to take some drastic societal steps, whether it be looting or it be government looting.
Yeah, I agree.
So the second tactic is to point to the future. And the idea, it's kind of utilitarian. It's basically, well, if it works, then it's okay. So if this unjust act will produce greater justice and equality in the future, then it's good. So there's another part where she says, after talking about private property being based in slavery and settler domination, she says, looting provides people with an imaginative sense of freedom and pleasure and helps them imagine a world that could be. And I think that's a part of it that doesn't really get talked about.
Isn't that your whole? Sorry. Isn't that your whole utopian, destructive utopia kind of idea?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
It's a great example of why the concept of utopia has been one of the most destructive things in the modern world, because it posits this possibility. Imagine a world that is freer. Imagine a world that's more equal. Imagine a world where no one's oppressed or no one's taken advantage of and everybody has everything in common.
Thanks, John Lennon.
Yeah, right. Now, if you do an act that you think in some way pictures that world, then therefore, by stepping into the imaginative world and creating that imaginative world, you are therefore justifying your own actions. So now, of course, what's crazy is that if that's the world you're imagining, that everyone has everything in common, but the way you're stepping into that imaginative world is by breaking windows and stealing stuff, then all you're doing is creating a world where a bunch of people break in and steal stuff. You're not actually actualizing a world of equality and peace and tranquility. You're just actualizing a world of looting where everyone's doing that to each other, which is another word for chaos. So I think this is one of the reasons why this kind of argument breaks down is whenever you try to create equality or justice through unjust and unequal means, then all you're doing is actually creating more injustice and more inequality. There's a power dynamic that goes on when looters break into a store and steal stuff. At that moment, the looters have all the power, and the store owner becomes the victim. So all you're doing is transferring the power dynamic from one party to the other party, but you're not actually creating equality. So we need to recognize that it's not simply that, well, even if this brings about change, you shouldn't do it if it's bad, even though that's a fine argument to make. You shouldn't do something if it's bad, even if it will bring about good results. But to also say that when you try to bring about good through bad results, all you're going to bring about is bad. There is no world where good comes from evil.
Yeah.
And so, but we see this over and over and over again in the rhetoric of our country, that in order for us to create greater equality, we need to take from some people and give to other people. It's the Robin Hood myth,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
And when Robin Hood steals from the rich to give to the poor, he's only teaching the poor that the only way to get wealth is to steal.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. So what's the antidote to this idea? Obviously, as Christians, we think the gospel is the antidote. It's the thing that's going to set us right, set society right. Reconciliation with God will ultimately bleed out into culture, into society, and reconcile people to people, people to the earth. You know, just reconciliation on a total scale. But like philosophically, what do we need to do? Like, how do we need to shape our minds and our hearts to I don't know, to fight this, to fight back against this kind of thing? Or I guess just what are your like initial thoughts on that?
My initial thoughts on that have to go back to being rooted in a consistent moral framework and a consistent understanding of what virtue is. But before we talk about that, we have to recognize that the idea of a consistent moral framework is being assaulted right now by everyone calling into question your ability as an individual, especially if you're white, your ability as an individual to know what's good and right and just. So this is the third tactic, which I think is the most insidious. And a friend of mine referenced this in terms of gaslighting, which I think was really insightful.
Oh yeah,
so
I wanted to hear your thoughts on this. I didn't know if you wanted to go there this episode, but yeah, I'm confused.
Yeah, I think
you need to explain it to me.
I think gaslighting is a really helpful thing to understand here. So the idea comes from a
Hitchcock, isn't it?
Well, it's an early British play actually that was then turned into a movie.
Okay.
But the idea is that this husband is convincing his wife that she's crazy. So she starts misplacing things, which really he's been taking, and then he tells her that she's going crazy, and then he is lighting this lamp, these gas lamps up on the second floor or in the attic, which causes the gas lamps on the first floor to go a little bit dimmer. And so she keeps commenting to him, the lights are growing dimmer. And he says, no, they're not. No, they're not. You are imagining things. And over time, he convinces her that she has gone insane and she can't trust her own powers of perception. That's where we get the term gaslighting from, because he's lighting the gas lamps.
Yeah.
And so this idea that you cannot trust your own powers of perception is ubiquitous in the moral conversation of this country. So what we see often is that somebody says, well, isn't, taking private property wrong? And then, oh, no, the only reason why you're saying that is because you're part of the majority power structure that uses private property to oppress other people. So private property is actually not something that's yours to be protected by the government, but really a means of oppression. Okay, so you can't trust your own powers of perception about what's right and wrong. Or if you look at this article, this interview, the interviewer asked some questions about, like, well, I mean, isn't it the case that peaceful rioting or peaceful protests brought about most of the good of the civil rights movement. And then the author says, well, no, that's actually a lie that's been taught from the moment you get into school in order to convince you that the only means of social change is through peace. That's a lie. You can't trust what you've been taught. You can't trust your powers of perception. And if you look at the moral discourse in this country, so much of it is centered on this idea that you can't trust the history. We need to rewrite the history.
Yeah.
You can't trust. Right. The 1619 Project is all about that. You can't trust studies that are conducted because those studies are conducted based on white Western principles of, math or principles of surveys. It basically undercuts any ability you have. Well, this study
2 plus
says this.
2
Well,
2 plus 2 equals 5, and the only reason you don't believe that is because you've been programmed into white thinking.
Right, exactly. This study says this. Well, you can't trust that because maybe that study was funded by a company that would benefit from the study coming out its way, right?
Yeah.
So,
or what about this one? Is it so? One thing that I've noticed is the way that the word or the idea of capitalism has been lumped into this like oppression narrative is pushed by all these social groups, and the more you see that on social media, like for me, the more I'm questioning, like, am I missing something? Like, what? How do you take capitalism and make it into a system of oppression? And I just start questioning myself, like, what am I missing? Like, am I going crazy?
Right, exactly. These counter narratives that are so extremely antithetical to common sense make you question your own common sense. They make you question your own ability to read the world and perceive it accurately and to know what's right and wrong. So I see the most insidious of this happening when people come out to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't be rioting, or maybe we shouldn't be burning buildings, or maybe we shouldn't be stealing, or maybe we shouldn't defund the police because of these actions of police officers in a couple cities around the nation. The narrative is your moral perceptions and your moral categories are totally off. And actually, by you saying that, you are proving that you are a racist. And you think that you're after peace, and you think that you're after equality, but obviously you're after supporting the existing power structures. She says this in the article when the interviewer brought up, like, well, aren't these riots and looting, aren't they hurting the Black communities and making them poorer? And she says, oh, that's just a tactic that people say to make them feel like they care about the Black communities, but they really don't. So
I had a thought, and while you were explaining that, it came to my mind. Isn't this what Satan did to Eve in the garden? Did God not say? Or did God... Maybe it's not.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Did God really say that?
Yeah.
And maybe he said that because he doesn't want you to be like him,
Yeah. But anyway, sorry, that was tangent.
Right. Well, it is a type of deception, gaslighting, because it's forcing you to not trust your own beliefs, moral values, instincts, ways of perceiving the world. So then you have to trust somebody else to see it clearly for you. And even if it doesn't make sense, trust us because we are the enlightened ones. And so I think this goes directly to the question that you asked about what do Christians do? And I think I've seen this over and over again on social media that my Christian friends, a lot of them are buying into these narratives now. And I can't help but think it's because a lot more of really lies are coming into their head, and a lot less truth is coming into their head. If your moral framework is fundamentally based in you, and maybe the values that you grew up with, you will be broken down over time to mistrust all of those, which is why you need the Word of God.
Yeah.
And it seems like such a simple thing, like, oh yeah, the answer is always read your Bible or whatever. But no, you have to realize that whenever I'm listening over and over and over again to these narratives, I do start to question my own powers of perception. And maybe I am a racist, and maybe I am just perpetuating bad things. And then I go back and read the Bible, and it reorients my perspective. And Scripture does convict you of your sin. It will convict you. It'll pierce to the, to heart and soul, but it will also root you in the fundamental moral paradigms that you need to live out your life. Like, oh yeah, but stealing is still wrong.
Yeah.
And violence is still wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And personal property, that person's property is not mine. And envy is wrong. And so if people are supporting a progressive agenda based on envy, you can tell me all you want that the reason why I don't support it is because I'm a racist and want to perpetuate the white power structures. But I just think envy's bad. And I think it's bad because the scriptures told me it's bad.
Yeah.
So it gives you kind of a moral foundation that you can trust, because people are going to tell you you can't trust your own powers of perception. So better trust God's power of perception rather than the narratives that are coming out today.
Yes. The wise man builds his house on the rock. The fool built his house on the sand. Awesome.
Exactly.
Loved it. Everyone, the book is In Defense of Looting. I do not recommend it, but if you want to go get it, maybe I'll link it in the show notes. Maybe I won't. I don't know. We'll see. But I hope you enjoyed the episode. Everyone go like and subscribe to the podcast. We're on Spotify, YouTube, where else? Apple, Podbean, if you're into that. But yeah, I loved it. This was a short, quick thoughts episode. I think we went a little bit longer than last week, but still awesome. Love it. Don't be gaslit. Go love your neighbor, love God, go and build something, and have a nice holiday weekend. Talk to you later. Bye. Awesome. Oh.